I love this one so much, I have to show you guys. I didn't really get to show you the result the other day, but now I've finished it. I'm really into this loose knit type of style these days. It looks really casual, it's really easy to make, and I feel even if you make mistakes, you won't be able to tell because it's loosely knitted. The stitches are so spread out and you won't be able to tell even if you increased a stitch by mistake. The skills you need before we start is long tail cast on, knit and purl stitches. The skills I'm going to cover in this video include how to create distressed stitches, but this is only optional, so if you don't like how it looks, you don't have to do it. Picking up stitches around the armhole, shaping the neckline using the short row technique, working in rounds using double pointed needles, binding off stitches. Your double pointed needles need to be the same size as the circular one. The reason why we use this is because when we work our sleeves, we might not have enough stitches to go on that circular needle. So I'm going to show you how to work in rounds with these ones. You need at least 4 of it, but if you don't have these, the circular needle would still work using the magic loop method, but I'm not going to be covering that in this video. I'm going to use the long tail cast on. I'm going to leave a really long tail and make a slip knot. I'm using a 10mm needle. I'm going to cast on 104 stitches. This length is the circumference of the sweater body. Ten stitches is roughly 4 inches, so the circumference around the sweater body would be around 40 inches. And then join in the round, knit in rounds. When you join in the round, make sure these stitches are not twisted. And then I'm going to join to the first stitch. I'm going to mark my first stitch. And then I'm just gonna directly knit my first stitch. So I'm gonna keep knitting like this. When I come back to the stitch marker, I'm gonna show you how to create our first distressed stitch. So that's the first stitch. I went over a few stitches, but that's okay, it doesn't have to be exact. So when you want to create that distressed stitch, you're just gonna simply yarn over and then keep knitting. I'm gonna mark that yarn over, and then I'm gonna go ahead and finish this round. See you here. When I get to this marked yarn over, I'm just gonna knit it as normal. So I'm just gonna knit every stitch and work 5 or 6 rounds. It doesn't have to be a specific number. And then I'll show you how to complete a distressed stitch. So now I've worked my stitches to this yarn over. You're gonna see a big space right here. The stitch marker is just to help you find that stitch. So I'm gonna take it off. You can probably find it even without a stitch marker. So you're gonna find that big space and then find that stitch that's worked in the same column. So I'm 2 stitches away. I'm gonna knit 2 more stitches. So that's the space, and that's the stitch in the same column. This is very simple. This is where the magic happens. I'm just gonna drop this stitch and then keep pulling. Voila! Distressed stitch. Now I'm gonna continue knitting. I do suggest when you work a yarn over increase to create this distressed stitch, roughly mark where that stitch is, because when you've worked so many rounds above it, it's very easy to knit past that stitch and forget about it. So what I'm going to do from here is just keep working in rounds, and whenever I want to create that distressed stitch, I'm just going to yarn over, knit every stitch including that yarn over, work a few more rounds, and when I want to complete that distressed stitch, I'm just going to drop the stitch that is in the same column as the yarn over. So this is just 7 or 8 rounds. I'm gonna keep working my way up until it reaches my underarm. So it's gonna take us some time, but this should be a good TV project. So go ahead and continue your work. I'm gonna see you back here. So this is what I've got so far. This is the underarm. I think I've done almost 60 rows. It is about 17 inches. I'm pretty happy with how long it is. So once you've got your desired length, we're going to divide our stitches into 2 equal parts. So we've got our front panel and back panel. This is the beginning of the round, by the way. So that would just mean this is the center of my back because my join is here. I have 104 stitches, so that would mean I need 52 stitches for the front panel and 52 for the back panel. So from here, I count out 26 stitches to the purple stitch marker and 26 from here to the purple stitch marker. So together, from here to here is my back panel, and I've got 52 stitches. And since I have 104 stitches totally, I've got 52 stitches left for the front panel. This is just to mark that yarn over increase for that distressed stitch. I used one of my rings because I realized it's big enough for the needle. So I'm going to put a different looking ring here just to mark my first stitch. And I'm going to knit my stitches all the way to this purple stitch marker. So I've got to my stitch marker. These are the stitches for the back panel, and after the stitch marker are the stitches for the front panel. So I'm going to continue knitting to the other purple stitch marker. The other stitch marker means we've knit 1 row across the front panel. So I'm going to knit all the way back to the purple stitch marker because we're only going to be working the front panel back and forth like this, and we're going to leave all these stitches for the back panel on the needle. You can do that, or you can just transfer them to another needle if you have an extra one. But when you work your way back, we're not going to be doing knit stitches, we're going to be doing the purl stitches. Just pretend you don't have these stitches here on the needle, but just to separate the 2 sections, I'm going to put my stitch marker back on. And from there, I just purl my stitches all the way back to the other purple stitch marker. So I've purled my way back to the other stitch marker. I'm gonna transfer these stitches now to a scrap yarn or another needle because these tiny stitch markers make it hard for me to work my stitches. So I've got some scrap yarn here. I'm just gonna use my needle, thread through these stitches. Okay, so I've got my back panel stitches here transferred, and I've got my front panel stitches on my needle, and then I'm just gonna knit one row and purl the next one and continue knitting my front panel. And just for later, when I work my back panel, it's easier for me to count my rows. I'm gonna mark a stitch of the front panel and a stitch of the same row of the back panel. So these are in the same row, and then I can go ahead, work my front panel and my back panel, and when I count my rows, I just need to start counting from here. Okay, so I've done like 20 rows or so from here for the front panel, and this is only up to the front of my neck. It's not to my shoulder yet. And from here to here, it measures about 7 inches roughly. And you also want to make sure you end on the purl row here, and your next row is going to be a knit row, so it's easier for you to follow along with me for the next section. So next we're going to use the short row technique to create a curvy type of neckline. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to work my stitches from here, say to like around here, and then I'm going to turn my work and continue working back and forth like this, but each time I'm going to work fewer and fewer stitches like this, so we have that curvy shape here. And then after that I'm going to work my stitches across and then do the same thing here. Okay, so it's totally up to you how many stitches you want to leave at the center. I decided to leave 10 stitches at the center. I've got my stitch markers on the first and the 10th stitches. And then I have the same number of stitches on both sides. I made a mistake, so I have to re-record a few clips on the smaller sample. I have the same 10 stitches at the center for the neck opening. That is the right shoulder and that's the left shoulder. But of course, you're gonna have more stitches on both sides. So I'm going to knit my stitches across until I get to 2 stitches before my first stitch marker. Okay, so now I am 2 stitches to the stitch marker. I'm going to insert my right needle into the stitch that is 1 row below the next stitch, but I'm going to insert it from front like that. Knit into that stitch, and then place the stitch back on my left needle, and that is it. And then we're going to turn and just purl your stitches all the way back. And then when you finish that row, just start knitting your next row again to 2 stitches before this double stitch. This double stitch is kind of hard to miss because there are 2 loops coming out of this one loop. I'm going to do the same thing again. Insert my needle in the stitch below from front to back, knit into that stitch, and then place it on my left needle. Turn my work, purl this row, and then knit my next row. Okay, now I am 2 stitches to the second double stitch. That is the first one. That's the second one. And in my next stitch, I'm going to do that again. So we basically just create a new loop in the same stitch. And then I'm going to purl this row and knit my next row. Okay, so when you're knitting your next row, you're going to knit across the whole row. And when you get to this double stitch, you're going to knit it as one stitch. So just insert your needle in both stitches like that. So I'm going to knit across the row. On this side of the shoulder, we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to knit like this and back and forth. Continue working short rows. So I'm going to purl my stitches until I am 2 stitches to the marked stitch. When I have 2 stitches before the stitch marker, I'm going to do that double stitch from the wrong side, from the purl side, that is. I'm going to insert my right needle in the stitch that is 1 row below my next stitch, but from back to front, like this. And then I'm going to purl this stitch. Again, put this loop on my left needle and then turn. With my yarn at the back, I'm going to knit to the end of the row. And when I finish this row, I'm going to turn and purl my next row. Okay, 2 stitches before the double stitch. Insert my needle from back to front in the stitch that's 1 row below. And then purl this stitch. Place the loop back on the hook. Knit this row, purl the next one. Two stitches before the double stitch. We're going to do that a 3rd time. So the next row, which is a purl row, I'm going to work my stitches all the way back to the other side. When you purl the stitches, again for this double stitch, you're going to purl it as if it's 1 stitch. The second double stitch, and then 1 single stitch, and then our first double stitch. And that is it for the front panel. Then we're going to cast off these stitches. And to cast off a stitch, I need 2 stitches. So I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches and then just pull the first stitch over the next one. And then knit the next stitch. So we have 2 stitches here. Pull the first one over the next. You're gonna remember not to do it too tight. So you knit 1 stitch and pass the loop over it and do this across the row. Okay, got my last 2 stitches. Pass one over. You can leave some tail just to sew up the shoulder seam later. We can cut this yarn and then pull it through. And that is the front panel. So for the back panel, I'm going to have to first put the stitches back on my needle. So the back panel is actually really easy. We're just going to knit 1 row and purl the next one until we have the same row count as the front panel. This is actually the beginning of a round, and that's the end of a round, but they look like they're really just in the same row, so I'm not gonna join my yarn here. You can either join from here. If you join from here, your first row is gonna be a knit row. If you join from here, your first row is gonna be a purl row. So I'm going to join from here. So you're just gonna grab your yarn and then just knit from the first stitch, or you can do it like this. Hold it with my left hand and then just knit it as normal. And you're going to knit 1, purl 1, continue working your back panel. Now I've done enough rows for the back panel. This is the front, that's the back, and I know these 2 stitches are in the same row, so I counted the same number of rows from there. Now I know these 2 stitches are in the same row. So from this stitch, I've got, that's 5, 10, and the last row is actually the cast off row. So from here, I should have 5, and then that's 10. That means I'm gonna cast off the next row. So I'm gonna purl the first 2 stitches. And then you want to bring the yarn to the back so it's out of our way. Pass the first loop over the second one. And then you're going to purl the next stitch, but you need the yarn to be at the front. So you bring the yarn back and then purl your next stitch out of the way. First loop over the second one. And then bring yarn back to purl. And then continue doing this. And then when you have 1 loop on the needle, you just want to pull it through and then cut. So now that we've got our front panel and back panel, that is the front, you can see the curve here, and I'm going to join them at the shoulder seam. So if you look at this one here, this stitch looks really weird. We've got 1, 2, and 3 of them. And I'm going to mark the stitch that is on top of the third, 1, 2, 3, third double stitch. Like so. And same on the other side, just look for that stitch that has 2 loops. That's the first one, second, third one here. Put a stitch marker there. So when you sew your shoulders together, you're gonna work up to this stitch. And when you're joining, make sure the stitches line up. I don't have any thread here, so I'm going to use a new thread and I'm going to join the shoulders. And that's the last stitch. We're going to leave this one out because that's the first stitch of the curve. And then one shoulder is done. And then you're going to fasten off both ends. I'm going to go ahead and join the other shoulder, and then I'll show you how to do the sleeves. So this is the neckline. Next, I'm going to show you how to knit your sleeves from the armhole. Before we begin, you're going to have to see if you would have enough stitches to go on this circular needle. But if your armhole is pretty small and it doesn't look like it's gonna go on the circular needle, then you're gonna have to use double pointed needles like these ones. But for picking up the stitches, I'm gonna stick to my circular needle. So get our new thread. I'm going to uncurl the edge. Find that column on the side. You can see this thread connects these two stitches. So I'm gonna mark the other one. I got the other one right here. What I'm gonna do is insert my needle in here. So you should have 2 loops on your needle. And then I'm going to create a loop and then put it on the needle. Okay. So we're going to pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So that is the first stitch. I'm going to insert my needle in the next space and pull up a loop. Skip the next space, insert my needle in the very next space, and pull up a loop. Next space, one more loop, and then skip the next one. So 2 loops and then skip one. So 2 is the first loop, second loop, and then skip the next space. So continue doing this around the armhole. So I'm going to pick up a loop from this last stitch, and then that is it. And then I'm going to move the stitches to the other end of the needle. And I'm going to tie these 2 ends together so it doesn't come loose. and I'm going to knit in the round. I'm going to use my first double point needle. Make sure you grab the correct tail and then begin knitting. And after you knitted about 1/3 of the stitches, pick up a second regular needle, continue knitting from the next stitch. Okay, and then a third needle, and pull the stitches to the other side, and then continue knitting. When you finish your last stitch, you're going to pick up your fourth needle. The rest is just knitting in the round. So you're just gonna work from the next stitch. This is the beginning of the round actually. And every time you finish your last stitch on the needle, you're gonna have one needle free. And then you're going to continue knitting from the next stitch. Like this. So just continue working in the round like this until the sleeve is long enough. And don't forget, at the same time, you can keep working your distressed stitch. How many rounds you should do for your sleeve really depends on how long you want your sleeve to be. Mine measures around 19 inches. Because we started from the underarm, you're gonna make sure you stop your round at the underarm. And once you reached your desired length, you're going to cast these stitches off. And then you're going to start working on your other sleeve. And then you join this stitch with the first stitch. I honestly don't have a certain way of doing this. I just kind of mimic the stitch. So I'm going to go in the next stitch, top 2 loops. Next stitch, top 2 loops from the back. And then come back to this stitch, but from the front. Back to the last stitch from the back. And then I'm going to go through the stitches at the back. Back and forth like this. And then I'll go through the same loop a few times. And just tie a knot like that. It's not perfect, but it works for me. If you want to learn the proper way, I'm pretty sure there is a proper way. You can look it up easily. The last thing we're going to do is the color. I'm going to use these double pointed needles again. The first thing to do is pick up the stitches. I'm going to do it from one side of the seam. If you still have the markers on, that is actually the first stitch. But you can also look at the column. You can see this column is already joined to the other stitch. So that is the first stitch I'm going to pick up. I'm going to leave this on so you can see. So you're going to make sure you don't leave any stitches, otherwise it will turn into a big hole. And another thing, make sure your finished stitch number is an even number. That's enough stitches for one needle. Pick up my second needle and continue picking up stitches. And that is the last stitch of the front panel. And just to make sure I don't leave a hole at the seam, I'm gonna pick up one stitch at the seam. Continue doing this around the collar. This is the other shoulder seam. Picking up my last stitch for the back panel. And then one stitch at the seam. And then I'm going to tie a knot here, just to secure the stitches. My stitches are not evenly distributed, so I'm going to transfer some stitches around to even them out. And then we're going to begin the rib. It is super easy. I'm going to begin with a knit stitch. Knit one stitch. And then I'm going to bring the yarn to the front. Purl the next stitch. Bring yarn to the back. Knit the next stitch. Bring yarn to the front. And then purl a stitch. Bring yarn to the back. So when you knit a stitch, make sure your yarn is at the back. And when you purl a stitch, make sure your yarn is at the front. And my last stitch of this round is a purl stitch. So that's one round finished. And then I'm going to begin the next round with a knit stitch. If you don't know where you are, you can look at the stitch here. The one without a bar is a knit stitch. The one with a bar is a purl stitch. So you knit the knit stitch, and then that's a purl stitch. You're going to purl this stitch, bring the yarn to the front, and then purl this stitch. Like that. So I'm going to continue knit the knit stitch and purl the purl stitch and just continue working in the round. I'll see you when I've worked enough rounds. So for the collar, I did 20 rows in total because I'm going to fold it like this so it can act as a turtleneck. So however tall you want your collar to be, do twice the length. And I also switched back to my circular needles, and then we're going to cast off. But just know that if you cast off like we've been doing, this edge is not going to be stretchy. But that is what I'm going to show you because I want this tutorial to be really easy for everyone to follow. So basically, I want this edge to look like this. But don't forget, we're going to fold it like this. So instead of casting off knit-wise, I'm going to do it purl-wise. So it doesn't matter if a stitch is a knit stitch or a purl stitch, you're always gonna purl it. Again, you're gonna want to do this really loosely because remember, this cast off is not as stretchy as the normal stitches. This is the last stitch. And then just like before, you want to pull the yarn through, cut it, and just use your yarn needle to join it to the first stitch. And once you've done that, the turtleneck is done, and then you're gonna weave all other tails in, and then we're finished.